Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the TFITS podcast. My name is Mac Rowe, and I'm joined here tonight with a good friend of mine. To my right, how are you this evening?
I am great. How are you doing tonight?
So far, so good, man.
Great.
Welcome to the Spacement.
Thank you for having me.
Such a beautiful evening to be doing a podcast. Thank you for joining us. Man, I tell you, it's sometimes Wednesdays are rough, you know?
Absolutely.
It's hump day. You got your camels. You got your internet
Sometimes
frogs.
you get two humps.
Yeah, sometimes you get no humps. But that's a story for another time.
That's another podcast.
Right on. Well, you know, we've got a lot of topics we want to cover on this show eventually. We've been going back and forth on some ideas, some topics to cover for you guys. Once we get the email set up and everything, we'll be looking for your suggestions. But tonight, producer, if you'll give us the drop, please. Tonight, the subject we are covering is...
Who are you? No, I really want to know. On this episode, we're going to discuss if you really are who you think you are as we dip our toes in the pool of free will and the simulation theory.
Ooh, simulation theory.
Mm-hmm.
And free will?
Absolutely. And a couple of other topics.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be doing a 3-hour podcast.
No, but really
I'm
kind
not
of...
Joe Rogan over here.
Well, we can hit on it as we talk about it, because honestly, well, the whole conversation that got me started was what were we going to talk about for our show, and so throwing back to, you know, some of our favorite comedy was the Upright Citizens Brigade. It was, was the worst thing you've ever done to somebody, and it was virtual reality.
Yeah,
so
I remember that. Yeah. So the guy thinks he's living his life, and he wakes up in the other guy's basement, and he's been...
Well, it starts out with people around.
They're all telling stories about the worst thing.
And George Clooney stole the story about shitting in somebody's litter box and making them think it was the cat, and then he did that years later. He was, oh yeah, George Clooney, you're a great prankster. No, Upright Citizens Brigade, you're the great pranksters. But no, so they did it, and so they tell everybody what they did, and it revolves like the worst thing they did to somebody in that room, and so it kind of progressed, and it focused on one gentleman in particular.
Right.
And the butt of the joke is, you've been living in my basement, being ass raped for the last 3 years, living in virtual reality.
Right.
All right. And so...
Which could still be true.
Oh, it absolutely could, because we could very well be living in a simulation right now and not even know it. And the whole crux for this argument that kind of made me really want to start discussing this, though, was watching Avengers Endgame. No spoilers. Michael Douglas's character, there's a scene where they CGI him to make him look very young. And right now, it looked really good, like amazingly good. I couldn't distinguish the fact that, you know, it was CGI. But in a few years, I know, looking back on it, I'm going to be able to tell that that's CGI. I'm going to be able to see the markers and know what it is. Same way, like when the Hulk came out in 2003, it looked amazing.
But you could tell. And if you look at it now, it hasn't held up, right?
Yeah, it looks like
it's funny how that works, because you think some of the CGI in the late 90s, early 2000s was incredible at the time, but a lot of it has not held up.
No.
Yeah, speaking of Endgame, I did catch that over the weekend, so you're not going to spoil anything from me. And I was amazed by Michael Douglas's retrogression of age. So you think that was all CGI? You don't think they were taking an old...
No, absolutely not.
old footage of Michael Douglas and superimposing it on top of, or maybe that's part of the CGI process? I don't know how it works.
I'm sure that's all part of the CGI process. But yeah, that was all completely CGI. And I don't want to say why, because spoilers, but during that scene, there was... no talking, and our deep fakery now is getting to the point to where they could have taken his voice and made him say anything they wanted to from previous things that they had.
But the quality, I think, is hit or miss with that stuff, and especially when you let the algorithm do it. But that's great that you brought that up, because that was going to be my next point, was that, you know, we have these deep fakes now. What was the one I saw the other day? They put Joe Rogan on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And it was pretty hilarious. And yeah, they were making him say all kinds of stuff, you know, and when you have that much footage of someone's face and all these different angles, the algorithm can plaster it over it. I'm wondering if they did something like that with Michael Douglas, but if it was all CGI, that's pretty amazing. Because the last one I remember was actually in the Star Wars franchise. They had Leia at the end. That was definitely CGI, but it was pretty well done. Not as good as Michael Douglas's. And then we had Tarkin, I forget the actor's name, but he was completely CGI. And,
absolutely.
You could tell at some points there was some Uncanny Valley stuff going on, but I think in the right lighting and everything, it looked really good. So, and how that applies to simulation theory, is actually pretty interesting if you think about it, because
Absolutely.
if we can do that now with our primitive technology, just think about what, a truly advanced civilization could simulate.
All right, but let's take that one step further. Why aren't they simulating that now? How do you know that they're not? Because
Right.
according to Descartes, you cannot trust your senses. You have to actively explore and test to ensure that you're actually in reality versus being in a dream, or in this state, and not necessarily a dream. It could be a simulation running for a computer. It could be a simulation running in a game. It could be a number of different types of simulations.
Right.
But could be living in a simulation, and you can't trust your senses because you can see the technology and you can see it progressing.
Sure.
And it looks good now, but in a few years it looks kind of not so good.
Okay.
But how can you tell the difference when you're actually actively living in it? Because going back to, like I said, what's the worst thing you've ever done to somebody? He was living in the guy's basement for the last 3 years getting raped.
Mhm.
He didn't know because he was living in the virtual reality. That camera was there.
Right.
And we've had this technology. I mean, my first intro to virtual reality was, in the early 80s, 90s, at the mega malls where, capitalism is king. But that at the time was amazing and mind-blowing. And now we have these home versions, which are far superior to anything that I ever experienced on a giant commercial level that was meant to be for consumerism.
Right.
But it's so realistic. And this is what we have now for just a couple of $100s. What are we going to have for just a couple of $100s in a decade or two?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be able to stimulate more than just our visual senses, something that's going to be able to get you tactically, something that's going to get your olfactory, smells, taste, touch.
Yeah, I remember in the 90s they had something where you could smell the internet. They had some sort of little spritzer that would shoot out different scents. I find it interesting you brought Descartes into this. Cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, in the original Latin. He was a philosopher that, well, at the time he would have called himself a natural scientist, but he broke down. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Natural philosophy, that was before science, and that's what Descartes would have considered himself, or maybe an alchemist on the side. But what could you really prove to yourself without computers, without any sort of an abacus or anything, a calculator? And he was proving. He wanted to know what could be proved beyond all doubt, and he said there really is only one thing you can trust, is that I exist. Like the I in that statement, cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is that I exist, and that is all I can prove, is that I exist, because I am thinking, therefore I must exist. So within the framework of our simulation discussion here, how does the I fit into the framework of the simulation? Like, how is the I itself, are we being simulated? Because there is another theory, and I'm going into this blind. I don't really, I'm letting you pick the topic for the show, so I'm just going off of past experience here. But I do remember reading about simulation theory in the vein of computer scientists of our time looking forward and saying, we can do this now. So if we expand that out to the future, if this civilization and our science continues to progress for another 1,000 years, another million years, then eventually we'll be able to simulate every known particle in the galaxy and what it's doing at that point in time.
Correct.
So if you can simulate an entire galaxy, at that point, what is the difference between reality and simulation? There inherently is none.
Yeah.
Except that the simulation, perhaps, you can control, you can change, you can make better for the existence of those within. So that would be my main argument against the simulation theory, playing the devil's advocate a little bit here.
Okay.
Human suffering exists. Okay, the Buddha famously said, life is suffering, and
think of
nirvana is beyond suffering. So why would suffering be programmed into the simulation?
Because the suffering would be necessary, because we're thinking about it as a simulation, as being, just brute forcing codes, zeros and ones.
Right.
But in the actual program, we're brute forcing problems in situations.
Sure.
So those situations actually have to be run through fruition. You have to see the best of the best and the worst of the worst to see what the actual outcome is going to be.
All the probability waves are factored and then collapsed on the most likely outcome. Basically, that's how reality works. So,
and the simulation is
simulation
whether
would work
this
similarly,
version of humanity is going to work or not, whether this version of Homo sapiens is going to work or not. This version of the because there's obvious. We can see civilizations that have existed for thousands of years, well beyond ours. We may have thought of them as being, dumb and primitive, but they absolutely weren't. They could have been smart. The things that they have built are far surpassing anything that we would have been able to do.
Go ask a contractor today to build the pyramids and see what happens. They literally can't do it. We have all this technology, but we don't have the know-how. We don't have the knowledge. We don't have the understanding to build what they built the way that they built it. So
Yeah, and now
we could build something similar to a pyramid, but it would not be what they built, and it would not be the way that they built it. So it's interesting to think that.
Now, who's to say they weren't brute forcing a code, and so that done? So now we have ours that's
exactly.
come up, and we're just running our course. We're
Well,
going to come out, and there will be a new one that'll come from the ashes.
And who's to say those ancient civilizations aren't part of the simulation?
Yeah.
I mean, so another thing that I've read about this in the past is that one explanation for this would be an ancestor simulation. So humans are actually millions of years in the future right now, but they've lost so much of their own history that they've decided with their amazing advanced technology to build a simulation, which we now live in order to simulate what really happened to their ancestors and how they evolved and how
they got to the point where they're at now.
And that strikes me as a very good explanation. It totally makes sense. I mean, right now we play VR video games that immerse us in whatever we want, but we could be in ancient Egypt. We could be on the ship that Christopher Columbus is on, coming across the ocean to America in 1492, you know? So we could put ourselves at any point in history now. So think about a million years from now, if humans don't destroy themselves, then we could easily have the technology to simulate this reality, which could be...
For science or for fun. This could be an entertainment thing.
This could be a science fair project for a 12-year-old, you know?
Yeah.
That they're so advanced that, you know, they're running an ancestor simulation. And, you know, this could be observed in different ways. If everything's quantum at that point and based on quantum technology, then...
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the quantum technology, because who's to say that we're not a simulation, but we've been thinking about simulation as being a computer program or a video game, but who's to say that we're not a simulation of probability within a living organism?
Okay.
Because if you can take science and you can break down matter. The hardest thing you can find glass, you can break it down. It's always fluid. It's moving. You can go down into the smallest parts of it. There's empty space in there.
Yeah,
and there's
90% or something is empty space.
You know, representational.
Particles aren't even really particles. They're waves of energy at the most fundamental.
And that will relate back to Descartes' I think, therefore I am, because if you think and you observe yourself, then you can make it happen.
Sure.
And so that becomes the probability of what's happening inside of these particles.
Right.
And so what we are is what's happening to one individual possibly, and we're going to dictate which way they could possibly go. But there's multiple of these worlds existing at this exact point in time, doing that exact same thing, and that's going to determine what action they take. So that's going to relate back to free will. So now, are we predetermined to make those decisions because we're a program running that simulation?
Right. Okay, so that removes free will from the simulation. But going back to the Avengers, this isn't a spoiler because it was actually in the last movie before Endgame, which was Infinity War.
Yes.
And Doctor Strange went into his trance, and he came back and said, "I just checked out whatever it was, 14 million different realities, and there's only one where we win."
Yeah. And I guarantee you that was the first one that he saw. The first one he saw was the win, and he's like, "Yeah, let's see what happens." And he's like, "Ah, shit, 14 million losses, fuck." And there was one where Ant-Man was just tiny enough and shot up into Thanos' dick and then exploded in there. There was one reality where that was true.
Well, sure, yeah, of course. In an infinite...
In 14 million universes,
all
that
of it
happened.
Yeah, he would have went up his butthole. He would have went up his, his urethra, everything. But, yeah, it's very interesting because it removes free will from the equation if we are being simulated. So therefore, the I, the me that thinks I am, is actually being simulated. But I ask you this, if every molecule, if every particle, if every nuance of our reality is being simulated by this 12-year-old science project a million years from now, then how would our consciousness be any less real than it actually was? Because if every particle that our consciousness is built upon, I guess that goes back to the fundamental question of matter before mind or mind before matter.
And can you test it?
Exactly. So this goes back to Descartes, and you really can't prove what came first. Is it mind before matter, or is it matter before mind? Does consciousness create the universe, or is the universe there and consciousness happens to rise up from the physical reality of the universe, which is what a lot of scientists would tell you. But I've always believed it to be the other way around, that consciousness creates reality as we see it. So that's why we keep discovering new things in science, because we're literally, when we look at something, we're creating it. Down to the fundamental physics again, wave-particle duality. So wave can be both a particle, light can be both a particle and a wave, depending on whether or not we're observing it at the time.
Yes.
So reality has some very strange kooks in it, which is why it may be a simulation, because that's the kind of thing you might find. The people that built the simulation wouldn't need to go down to such a minute level, only enough to fool us. So, when we start breaking apart quarks and we see little glitches in the matrix, how did Neo realize that there was a glitch in the matrix? The black cat walked by twice, and when you catch little glimpses of that. There's a new term I picked up recently. So we have déjà vu, but then there's another term, I'll have to look it up, but it's déjà arterium or something. It's dream in French, whatever that is. And I've had this happen before, but it's not déjà vu. When you're in something and you remember it, but you're remembering it because you had it in a dream. It's a very specific kind of déjà vu, and they've just recently come up with a name for it, which I thought was really interesting because it's something that I knew about years ago because I'm like, wait, this moment that I'm in right now, I actually had a dream that I was in this moment. So that starts to fuck with your idea of time and space. You know, if time is really an illusion due to entropy moving in one direction, then everything's happening at once, and we have the illusion of time because we're moving through that entropy. But you know, down at the fundamental roots of it all, it's already all happened or is happening all at once. So the term that I was trying to think of is déjà revers. Sorry, there's déjà vu and there's déjà revers. Déjà vu is you know, remembering something like you've already been there, but déjà revers is remembering something like you were already there in a dream specifically. So
that's it. Okay, I'm glad you said it because that got me back to my point. You're accessing, the simulation is running, so you have all the different probabilities or possibilities that are out there. But when you're in the dream state, you were able to accidentally access one of those files because you're able to access your computer when you're like the lucid state. So when you're in lucid state dream, you're able to access it. And so when you come out of it and you're put back into the program, you still kind of have that faint memory of it. So when it actually happened, because that's what that probability happened for that point in time, you remember doing that. And that will happen for other different points in time, for other dreams.
Quantum physics tells us that that's no different than how reality actually works, because probability mechanics tells us that, you know, every action we take, whether I decide to put my arm down here or, whoops, I shouldn't hit the mic when I do that.
No,
when
but
I try to put my arm down at point A, point B, or point C, all of those things happened. It was just that when I decided to hit point B, the probability waves for A and C collapsed. They were happening. All of them were happening at once, but in reality, only one of those probability waves actually manifested. But they were all actually occurring in the underlying framework that is reality. That's what quantum mechanics tells us. And on that note, folks, we're going to take a short break. Here's some words from our sponsors. We'll be right back.
Woo.
Welcome back to the podcast. That was a good advertisement, and I hope you buy all of their stuff that they are selling.
7 or 8. You should get more.
You should buy all the things. All right, back to the subject at hand. Let's define our terms. We maybe should have done this at the beginning, but we don't like format on this show, ladies and gentlemen. Simulated reality is the hypothesis that reality could be simulated, for example, by quantum computer simulation, to a degree indistinguishable from true reality. It could contain conscious minds, which may or may not be fully aware that they are living inside a simulation. This is quite different from the current technologically achievable concept of virtual reality. Virtual reality is easily distinguished from the experiences of actuality. Participants are never in doubt about the nature of what they experience. Simulated reality, by contrast, would be hard or impossible to separate from true reality. There has been much debate over this topic, ranging from philosophical discourse to practical applications in computing. So that was a mouthful, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows specifically to what we were referring. Of course, you can look this up on your favorite internet search engine, but some of the key points, of course, in the simulation argument were first laid forth by that old guy, Descartes, that we were talking about earlier.
Well, you can even predate him either. I mean, let's go with...
well, the Egyptians thought that life was a dream that you wake up from.
Yeah, well, even...
death is reality.
To predate the Egyptians, in China, Zhangji, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name.
Yeah, so that was the guy that was had the butterfly dream, and when he woke up, he was like, am I a man dreaming I'm a butterfly, or...
A butterfly dreaming I'm a man.
Right, yeah. So this has roots deep in human thought, obviously. You know, the idea of the parallels between a dream and simulation are interesting because I don't know if you remember the movie Waking Life. It was an animated movie back in the day, but it was a lot of different little philosophical... They just kind of threw it in as conversations, but they were all different philosophical points of view.
Yeah.
And they actually taught philosophy classes on this movie afterwards because it breaks down different schools of thought like very nicely and has examples of different ideas. But there's a section in there where they talk about the difference between dream and reality, and the interesting thing is you can become conscious in a dream.
Yeah.
You can become aware of the fact that you're in a dream and remain within the dream. So,
which is collectively known as lucid dreaming.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. So wouldn't that be a simulation in your own mind? Like, if your mind
Exactly.
is a computer and you're having a dream, then you're creating your own simulated reality in which you are existing or doing, hunting tigers or having sex with Margaret Thatcher or whatever you do in your dreams. I'm not going to judge.
But that's goes into the next point of, even though that's what you are experiencing, what your dream is actually encompassing might be some ultimate angle that could be the reality where somebody finds the cure for cancer. And so because that happened in the dream, then they know, all right, this is the simulation we're able to take to make that happen. And so it's some from some future technology,
right,
or computational expression, where we are expressions of zeros and ones on a computer, on a hard drive someplace. We experience it in real life. We can't test it because we can feel it, we can smell it, we can taste it, we experience it. But then again, what makes us us? Are we doing the things that we do because we want to do them?
right.
Or do we lack free will when we're doing this on a rail because that's what the simulation dictates of us?
Sure.
You and I might have a consciousness of our own, but we exist only in the consciousness of someone who is lucid dreaming themselves, creating their own simulation. So we exist in their world, free to do what we want, but only within the bounds of what they allow us to do in their program.
Sure. So, do we have free will within the simulation itself? Basically, is the question.
Or are
if
you
we're
on
already
rails?
programmed? And this has a lot of. If I was trying to argue this case one way or the other, there's a lot of underlying evidence that points to the fact that we do not have free will. For example, if I move my arm again, I always like using that as an example because I have an arm. No shade on
Lucky
people
you.
that don't have arms, but biologically, if you break down the actions that it took to move my arm, long before I consciously thought to move my arm, the signals were already being sent. Like the blood vessels were already contracting. The nervous system was already sending electrical signals to cells further down my arm to move that arm. So was that a predetermined action that I had no choice in? And the evidence seems to say yes sometimes. It's a conundrum that we're trapped in because it feels like I have free will. I've made really bad choices in my life, and I hate to think that that was predestined.
Well, that
But
would
I've
also
made
allow some people to come with terms for the things that they've done.
I guess, but I mean,
order
and then
to
I'm
move
also
forward.
you also get a sense of achievement when you make a good decision or make a good action in life. So, you're that feedback system, regardless of if we have free will or not. The feedback system rewards that action. So, if we look at it from the perspective of evolutionary biology, why would we evolve to have a reward system for making choices if we didn't really have a choice? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, the purpose of the choice is to, improve and become better and to progress and to go forward.
Sure.
And sometimes, and who's to say that, the point of the simulation isn't to relive the life that you've lived several times over to make better decisions than you did last time
Sure.
in order to progress to the next life, to have a better life,
Sort of like leveling up
to
in a video
achieve
game.
the end goal. Exactly. And you have to fight the final boss at the end. And
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't, then, you start over and start your princess in another castle.
Sure.
Take this
She's
with
always
you.
in another freaking castle.
What the fuck is this shit?
Ah.
So, I mean,
Oh, I forgot to say the name of our podcast.
that's
Yeah,
all good.
right.
We got it.
Yeah.
Titular.
It always works its way in. That's why we ended up naming the podcast after it, I guess.
Yeah.
Sure. So circling back around to Shangzi.
Shangzi.
If you just say it with attitude and confidence, then
Shangzi.
it sounds like you know what you're talking about, I guess.
I apologize. I'm just trying. I don't know. But
Once Shangzi dreamt he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Shangzi. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Shangzi. But he didn't know if he was Shangzi who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Shangzi. Between Shangzi and a butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. That's a direct translation from a well-known verse by Shangzi called Butterfly Dream. So even thousands of years ago, let's see, he was from the 4th century BC, so roughly, 2,400 years ago.
yeah.
This guy, this Chinese fellow,
Yes.
was writing a poem. I think he was probably, I wonder if they had opium that far back.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
They have found hemp in caves that dates back,
Yeah.
10, 12,000 years. So
I'm
we
sure
were
of it.
definitely using it for fibrous
Yeah.
things before, and then maybe we, at some point along the way,
Accidentally.
we realized, like, huh,
I'm cleaning this synthesizer right here, and whoops, I accidentally got LSD on my finger, and I'm going to trip. Which just recently happened with at MIT. I don't know if you saw that, but that was great.
yeah, no, I think I saw a picture in some kind of article online to something to that effect. I'll have to check it out. But
It's amazing. But yeah, no, but I think the important part of what his poem was the butterfly didn't have consciousness of Zhangzhou at all. Like the butterfly only had consciousness of itself, and it
As
was
a butterfly,
happy
right,
as a butterfly,
right,
and
sure.
it was flying and it was happy, and
Yeah.
then it awoke.
right.
So was it Zhangzi dreaming he was a butterfly, or the butterfly dreaming he was Zhangzi?
There's no way to tell.
Exactly. That's the important part of it.
Sure.
If you only know who you are, and you wake up and you have these experiences, how can you truly determine what's real and what's not? And if you're able to make these decisions on your own.
Exactly. Well, and that brings to mind, a few different things actually. But have you ever heard? I wish I could remember the philosopher's name. He's more of a modern philosopher, maybe 70s, 80s. Pearl something. Anyway, the name's not important, but his theory, I think he used the idea of a beetle in a box. Have you heard this before?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so it's the idea of consciousness and how we cannot know what subjective experience is like for another human being. So if I have a beetle in a box and I carry it around, and I can look at my beetle and carry it around with me, but you can't see my beetle, and then you have a beetle in a box and you carry it around, you look at it, but I can't see your beetle, you can't see my beetle, then we all have this idea of a beetle, but none of us know if our beetle is anything like anyone else's beetle. It could be completely different,
Yes.
and often is shown to be so by the way that people behave. If you sort of start breaking those aspects of personality and consciousness down. But so the way that would apply to simulation theory, again, is that if we were going to simulate something, you look for things like efficiency, you look for things like ways to reduce overall calculating power, teraflops, what have you, in the program. So you'll compile your program, make it more efficient over time. So there's a lot of extraneous things, again, arguing from the other perspective that simulation, in reality is not simulated, would be that there's all these little idiosyncrasies to reality that don't have a lot of sense in light of a simulation. So why would our subjective experiences all be so different if we were all simulated? I mean, if we just need to act these things out, there's no reason for me to have a different inner world than you, unless that's part of the simulation, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
well, that could be a simulation within a simulation to make the program itself more efficient with exactly what you were just talking about. If the program can run a program, and then that program can run a program, and that program, you're able to exponentially reduce your computational power to within that one program. You're
sort
able
of
to
a
save
Russian
it,
doll sort of situation.
Exactly, but you're able to do that with power and programs. So you're able to run multiple simulations multiple times over
Sure.
within the program to get the quickest and fastest result.
No, that's great. Think about it. Another great analogy in our own bodies is the way our cells, our individual cells that over time learn to work together. And inside those cells, there's like mitochondria that are individual things that work within the cell. And it's more efficient that way. So the cell has little things that work inside of it. And that cell becomes part of a kidney, which is part of our system. And that's a bigger part, so everything's a system built on a system built on a system. And,
but you're unconscious of while it's happening.
Exactly.
So this is happening without you telling it
about
that,
my
oh
liver
shit,
filtering my blood.
Get over there. You're missing 3 cells over there. We need a couple more T cells. Come on, homies. Work together now.
And there's a lot of things like guided meditation where they actually try to do that and take conscious control of your T cells to fight cancer. Sure. Yeah. And there's been positive results. So very interesting. We could manipulate the simulation with our own simulations, basically. Hack the code like Neo in the Matrix,
Well, even with that, there's been studies shown where people have been able to do sensory deprivations to be able to
see the code.
Exactly. Well, that's how some people have described it. Some people have described it as meeting God and having deity experiences.
Right.
But what they've done is they've completely shut off all their sensories and then stimulated them at once, and then basically hit their pineal gland and cause it to release massive amounts of natural produced DMT at once, and send them into these voyages where they've seen the code or met these people or these things or some of these other simulations, or met the people quote unquote behind the computer, or people writing the programs, or even another program itself that's been another simulation, to see how this experience affects this individual when they've done these things to themselves. And this is things that ordinary people can achieve on their own.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting that you mentioned the pineal gland. Anyone that's familiar with ancient architecture will know that across all cultures, and the oldest like Sumerian, the really old stuff in Malaysia has a lot of this. The Olmec, they all have this weird little pine cone shaped thing on all of their, it'll be on the end of a stairs. Oh, and you just wouldn't even look at it or think of it. Oh, it's just like a decoration on the end of a banister. I think these are even found at Göbekli Tepe, which is starting to be dated. The lower portions are like 14, 15,000 years ago. People were building these huge stone circles, and on that is a pineal gland. So what do the ancient people know about the pineal gland? Because the latest in biology and stuff, if there is a seat of consciousness, it's probably the pineal gland. That's the third eye, right?
Yeah.
That's the, the opening, the doorway to the inner world. So, how did these ancient people know what this little pine cone shaped thing in their brain was, and why did they put it on all these carvings and sculptures and everything everywhere? Like, did they know they were in a simulation? Or maybe the early parts of the simulation, the programmers came down into the simulation to guide the simulated, and maybe they had to fix bugs in the program, and maybe the easiest way to do that with this type of software is to go into the software, okay?
Yeah.
So we have records of these things as gods, as, Jesus or Muhammad or Gandhi. Well, no, Gandhi was real, sorry. There's actually photos of Gandhi. I meant to say Buddha.
My grandmother met Gandhi once.
Shut up, Grandma, you're such a liar. So anyway, it's very interesting that all these ancient religions have this similar symbology, and it would really make sense if we were in a simulation and the programmers would come down into it, that they would be seen as gods, because they literally are. They created this world. So it's an interesting aspect to think about. And also, I mean, Neo in the Matrix was basically a Jesus figure. So, Jesus was able to see beyond the code. That's why he could walk on water. That's why he could heal the sick, because he was just hacking reality, basically hacking the simulation that God, i.e. the programmer, his dad made. It could have really been his dad. I don't know. It's like, Dad, let me play the video game again.
My turn.
Yeah. So
he's not sharing.
So yeah, there's a lot of evidence on both sides. I think it's a very interesting subject, and we could definitely do hours and hours on simulation theory. But I want to thank you, my friend, for bringing this topic tonight. I was not expecting it, and not expecting such a wonderful conversation about this topic.
Thank you for your expectations of me. I appreciate it.
Well, no, I mean, obviously, I try to go into everything with little to no expectations.
Yeah,
that's no gauge of your fantastic personage. It's just a gauge of my own expectations of reality, because if I do not have expectations, I am not disappointed.
Exactly.
On that note, folks, if you have any comments or questions about simulated reality, drop us an email.
And we might
leave a voicemail.
Oh, yes.
Hit us up on the tweeters and the book faces.
Oh, yeah.
And all those sort of things. And let us know what you think about simulated reality. Are we really us? Are we really real?
Who are you?
Is this really real? What the fuck is this shit?
The fuck is this shit? Damn, man.
All right. Well, have a great night, folks. And tune in next time to the TFITS podcast. I've been Mac Bro.
And I've been.
Have a great night.